It gives me great pleasure to introduce Graham Connolly. He's a barrister at the New South Wales Bar. He's in the Royal Australian Navy and has served his country in the Middle East and Afghanistan. He was an associate to the president of this society, the Honourable Ian Callanan. He is a lecturer in constitutional law at the University of Sydney and is the chief examiner for the New South Wales Legal Professional Admissions Board. It is an immense honour for me to introduce Gray Connolly because I was the best man at Gray's wedding. And in fact, this society and dear friends of mine, Ben Davies and Julian Lisa, are the reason why I've come to know Gray Connolly, a dear friend. So please, Gray, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me here to speak. As Michael said in his introduction, I practice in constitutional, public, national security, as well as commercial law, and I also teach and examine constitutional law for the University of Sydney's Law Extension Committee and also for the Legal Profession Admission Board. It is a great honour for me to come and speak to you, noting the very eminent personages that you've had speak already at this conference, including the Chief Justice of Australia, former Justice of the High Court and former Prime Minister. Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to talk about the Republic and the Crown in terms of the constitutional issues. I've always had the view that reasonable people can differ on the issue of whether you think Australia should remain as a constitutional monarchy or whether you think Australia should become a republic. Next slide, please. Whatever your view, however, it has always been my view, to borrow from Pope Leo XIII, the best course in human affairs is to view things as they are. And it's my view that any move by the Australian people to a republic, or a republican form of government, would require enormous and unsafe alteration of our constitution, such that a wholly new organic law would be the only safe solution should a republic be required. As I said, good people may and will differ on the merits of monarchies and republics in themselves and whether they think one is appropriate for Australia. The American Republic, for instance, offers a model of a classical republic with separations of powers and of all bodies, with the executive and the legislature as strangers, often hostile ones. The American model has its strengths and its weaknesses, though sadly, as you would all know, those strengths and weaknesses would only allow a good constitution to be made better through a very bloody civil war. The American model's influence was profound on our founders. The example and the writings of Alexander Hamilton was very influential on the Australian founders. Alexander Hamilton is a great hero of my own. Alexander Hamilton is one of those great men of history who the tide of history would have been completely different without him. That is the Alexander Hamilton of history, not the, frankly, idiotic musical that is propagated as a form of education to the masses. However, if the American model was to be adopted in Australia, I have absolutely no idea whether the Federal Electoral College would be acceptable to local Republicans. The United States is a federal republic. It is not a democracy. It is not required that the President win the popular vote. The President wins an Electoral College mandate of a federal country. Australia is a federal country. Would local Republicans accept a federal Electoral College for our federal country? Would something else be demanded? Who knows? As to the various other republics that are on offer, there is obviously the French Republic. I'm someone with open Gaullist sympathies. I greatly admire President Charles de Gaulle. I'm particularly partial to the Fifth Republic, which was the fifth attempt at a republic after so many. It offers a strong president and a strong cabinet system. It often has a strong parliamentary democracy. It also often has riots and demonstrations in the streets. It has a uniquely French culture. Whether it is something for export, I'm not sure, but nonetheless, if you are to be serious about republics, you have to look at what models are on offer. Finally, you also have the Irish, German and Swiss models, which I've always found dull and uninspiring. In case of the Germans, though, if you look back on the last century of German constitutionalism, perhaps a little bit of dull and uninspiring governance might not go astray. Next slide, please. As a personal aside, when Australians voted on a republic in 1999, I was preparing to deploy to the intelligence staff of General Cosgrove in East Timor, and a very dutiful Lieutenant Connolly voted no. Lieutenant Connolly voted no, as did everyone else around Lieutenant Connolly at the time. And as one Vietnam veteran in our draft going to East Timor said about why he voted no, and I'm cleaning up the language used for the very polite company that I'm in. He said to us, just remember, if these people, I've cleaned that part up, just remember, if these people can do this to the Queen, they can do this to any of us. But as was the case in 1999, so is the case now. I have absolutely no idea what is proposed in terms of a model for Australia's republic. I am constantly ensured that that's a matter of just filling in the details later. And for me, that is just populist, unserious pablum. It is incredibly dangerous. So my purpose this morning is to address you on why any move to a republic would pose an enormous threat to our current constitution. And to keep enthusiasm within bounds, please note that I do not intend to discuss issues of royal legitimacy, 1688, 1745, and how an obscure band of German Protestants ended up on the British throne. I would note, with an eye to history, that 100 years ago, the leading Stuart claimant was actually Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, who was one of the Kaiser's leading generals of the Great War. And noting the anniversary of Amiens, the 100th anniversary of Amiens coming up on the 8th of August, the Der Schwarztag, the Black Day of the German Army, perhaps these issues should just be left in the past and we should accept that we are where we are. Next slide, please. Now, as W.A. Wines, one of the great constitutional authors of the Federation era and early Commonwealth, he said, the central characteristic of the Australian Constitution is the predominance of the Crown in every aspect of governmental powers. To amend our Constitution would require at least these following key provisions to be amended, and I will go through them in the series. First of all, there is the preamble. If we can just go back a slide. The preamble to the Constitution. The Commonwealth of Australia, I'll pause here, Justice Callanan would always remind us when I was his associate that Australia was a cricket team before it was a country. However, the Commonwealth of Australia is literally constituted by our Commonwealth. I always say this to the students I teach. The Commonwealth of Australia, the actual entity, nation state, the Commonwealth of Australia, is constituted by the Constitution. And for a republic to occur, you would have to do great violence to our preamble. If you note the wording, whereas the people of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland and Tasmania, Western Australia, which joined later, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God, have agreed to unite in one indissoluble federal commonwealth under the Crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and under the Constitution hereby established. On any view you take, this preamble would have to change and a new sovereign authority found to replace the Crown. What would this new preamble read like? Your preamble gives force to the words in your Constitution. Also, would Australians still rely humbly upon Almighty God? The inclusion of God in the Constitution was very much, and I can say this as a Catholic, was very much a means of winning Catholic support for federation. Cardinal Moran was a very strong supporter of federation. In writings that he wrote about supporting federation, he did actually see it as an antidote to the growing power of local socialism, and he saw it, those were the days, by the way, when cardinals thought that way. Cardinal Moran saw the federation movement as an antidote to growing socialism and to growing left-wing revolutionary movements of the kind people who lived through the 19th century were all too aware of. And particularly if you're a Catholic, you had in the back of your mind the French Revolution and the incredibly bloody results of the French Revolution for people really of any faith and how disastrous republicanism was for Christians in particular. So that was very much in mind. Now, I have no idea whether in the new republic that is being proposed, God will stay in or he will be voted out. Will a more Jacobin approach be taken? We do not know. Next slide, please. Chapter 2 of the Constitution will have to be amended almost in its entirety. Chapter 2 of the Constitution sets out the executive power of the Commonwealth, which is vested in the monarch. Section 61 vests specifically the executive power of the Commonwealth in the monarch, which is exercised by the Governor-General as the Queen's representative. The Constitution's vesting of the executive power in the Crown means that along with the power we derive from the Crown's existence, also we derive our day-to-day Westminster governing norms of responsible government and, in a crisis, the exercise of the reserved powers of the Crown. In any parliamentary crisis, such as in 1932 in New South Wales, or the larger crisis of 1975 for the Commonwealth, it is the Governor-General's duty to ensure that the Constitution is maintained and the laws enforced, and especially to ensure that the Australian people decide through elections how a situation of government illegality or parliamentary deadlock is to be resolved. Hence the Governor-General's power in Section 5 to dissolve the House for fresh elections. If the Crown is abolished, so too are the received understandings that we have of how executive power is to be exercised. Inevitably, any republic will create a vacuum in the exercise of executive power, and it cannot be filled by a jurisprudence of cut and paste replaced with a president republicanism. The fundamental problem will be one of mandates. Any president of an Australian republic, any president, regardless of whether she or he is directly elected or is elected by the Parliament, will have an electoral mandate that no Governor-General, as the representative of the monarch, can ever have or seek to assert as against the Prime Minister of the day. It would be only human for an elected president with a national mandate to assert, and indeed it would be Herculean to not assert, that you should have a larger role in the affairs of the Commonwealth of Australia than any Governor-General prior to you has had. This would be true of even the most humble of presidential aspirants, and even then the temptations would be enormous. They would be great indeed. And who would seek to be president of a republic who would not have ambitions of some kind? We must be realistic here and see things as they are. There is no safe replacement, in my view, either, of the Governor-General by a president who is appointed by the Prime Minister of the day, and thus has no security of tenure. Chapter 2 was drafted on the basis that the Governor-General was the representative of the monarch, and on those royal and constitutional terms would exercise the executive power. It would be a dead letter if the exercise hinged on the President's likely dismissal by the Prime Minister of the day, and it would render almost useless the reserve powers that, in the final analysis, are the safeguard of our system when we have deadlock or illegality. In my view, Chapter 2 cannot now be tamed or warped into a republican provision. Instead, in my view, any republic would require wholly new provisions setting out what the Republican president may or may not do in explicit terms, especially if that president is to cohabit, in the way of the French, is to cohabit with an elected Prime Minister who already enjoys the confidence of the House of Representatives. The potential for frequent conflict between these two executive office holders, who both have their own national mandates, is obvious, as is the scale of the chaos that could well ensue if they are deadlocked. To that end, next slide please. Section 5 allows the Governor-General in our Constitution to prorogue the Parliament and, where necessary, to dissolve the House of Representatives. The exercise of this power now is almost always only done on the advice of the Prime Minister of the day to cause a federal election. However, in times of crisis or deadlock, Section 5's power may be exercised by the Governor-General to force new elections and to ensure that the Australian people are the ones to resolve a parliamentary crisis at the ballot box. The great important thing to remember about the reserve powers is when the monarch exercises them against the elected government of the day, the reserve powers are being used to force fresh elections. So it is the people who will decide how a dispute or a deadlock or a situation of illegality will be resolved. The monarch is acting very much in our system as the guardian of the public's right to determine the destiny of the polity. It is hard, in my view, to see how any future Republican president possessed of a national mandate, where faced with an opposing Prime Minister, especially if that Prime Minister was unpopular, could avoid the temptation to dissolve the House and to seek new elections that could remove that difficult Prime Minister. Absent the Crown and precedent regulating this power's exercise, one can foresee Section 5 enabling the slow accretion of power to the presidential office by the frequent calling of elections for the House to remove opposing Prime Ministers. Next slide, please. We come now to the armed forces, something of grave importance to me. Section 68 sets out that the Governor-General is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. This Command-in-Chief proceeds, again, on the centuries-old royal understandings of a monarch commanding their armed forces, a command that is exercised by the Crown today only at the advice of the elected government of the day. In the Republic, though, the issue of who would Command-in-Chief the armed forces and on what terms remains at large. One presumes, perhaps wrongly, that the future president will have some powers of military command while having also the national mandate of either a parliamentary vote or a direct popular vote. One does not know what would happen to the prerogative power to deploy the armed forces and make war. Would a resolution of a Republican Parliament now be required for Australia to deploy armed forces. A clearer problem is what would the armed forces be expected to do when a president and the Prime Minister, again both with their own electoral mandates, disagreed on matters of war and peace, or in a time of domestic crisis, or they disagreed on what should be done to suppress terrorism, riot, disorder, or insurgencies. One should note here that Section 119 obligates the Commonwealth to protect every state against invasion, and on the application of the executive government of the state against domestic violence. And this raises the obvious problems of who decides what protection of the applicant state may involve. The armed forces cannot be left to guess. They cannot be left to guess as to who their chain of command includes, what that chain of command involves, and I would warn you, in the long history of Republican collapses, and it is a very long history of republics collapsing, they have not infrequently been brought to their end by a push or a coup, or because of a civil war or some economic slump forcing the military to take power in a time of chaos. There is a reason why the examples of Sulla and Caesar loom large in any history of Rome. While such military stirrings against the civil power are anathema to our history and to our traditions, so too is the idea of a republic. If you will the republic, you will also the disorder that any republic entails. This is why, if you will for a republic, you have to get your constitutional workings right the first time. Next slide, please. Now we come to the states. What is to be done with the states? And what is to be done given sections 106, 107, 108 and 118 of the Constitution? Each of the Australian states that came together to constitute the Commonwealth of Australia, or their peoples came together to constitute the Commonwealth of Australia, each of these states has their own royal governor. Each has their own state constitutional foundation and relationship to the monarch. Any federal move to a republic is not necessarily binding on the state crown. Each state and their people have a governor and a state parliament. I recommend strongly, as I do to all of my students, the magisterial work of Professor Anne Toomey of Sydney University, The Chameleon Crown, the Queen and her Australian governors. It is excellent. The potential position of royal states attempting to exist within a national republic is the stuff of constitutional minefields. And one should note here that, at least in Western Australia, there are already strong histories of local secessionism. We also... So these are just some of the major provisions that a republic would seek to have amendments made. Others, such as sections 16, 34 and 44, deal with the constitutional qualifications of senators and House members. They will have to be amended, as would the concept of a subject of the Queen. That would have to be amended because a republic would render nugatory the idea of being a subject of the Queen. Moreover, there can be little doubt, in my mind, that following on from the recent parliamentary citizenship debacles, that proposals would be made that persons with dual citizenship should be eligible for election to the House and to the Senate, and presumably they would then be eligible to go on to hold ministerial office. One awaits the referendum that asks Australians to agree to having dual citizens to hold the offices of Prime Minister, Treasurer, Attorney General, Home Affairs Minister, Defence Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister. The list of problems with such a proposal are obvious. And I go also to the fact that our Constitution was designed deliberately to prevent easy changes, such we would have to have a referendum. And assuming that all of these somehow necessary Republican alterations can somehow be agreed upon by the constitutional conventions and by the Parliament, then the Republic would still need to be approved by the Australian people in a way that satisfies Section 128's requirement for a double majority. The Republic would need to be supported by both a national majority of all electors, and it would also be required to be supported by a majority of the electors in a majority of the states. Over the past 117 years of the Australian Commonwealth, the Australian people have passed only 8 of the 44 referenda that have been proposed, with the most recent 1999 referendum on an Australian Republic being defeated in all states and succeeding only in the Australian Capital Territory. This history is not encouraging for major changes of the kind that will have to be proposed by the domestic Republican movement. Next slide, please. As to my own thoughts, the rule of law, once lost, is extraordinarily hard to re-establish. The grisly fate of the Kerensky and Weimar republics, to name just 2, attempted as they were in ancient and formerly monarchical states should always be uppermost in anyone's mind. So also should be the fact that the British constitutional monarchies of the 20th century were infinitely better at weathering the stresses of 2 world wars and depressions without any shift away from the Westminster system and to authoritarianism. For over 117 years, the Australian Constitution has survived wars, depressions, Cold Wars, hung parliaments, numerate and ethically dubious governments, as well as crooked representatives and senators. Further, for well over a century, tens of millions of people have left their homelands to immigrate to Australia with the security and stability of our Constitution and commitment to the rule of law, an unspoken but foundational attraction. It is said against monarchy that it is undemocratic, remote and anachronistic. However, in my view, these qualities are only but a few of its strengths. A monarch cannot be ejected by the ambitious politicians of the day, many of whom resent that they may aspire only to be ministers of the Crown and not holders of supreme power. The Crown, in a sense, is a guardian of our Constitution and not some proto-dictator eager to dictate to us in the polity. Next slide, please. And yes, the monarchy is as irrelevant to our age as the monarchy is to every age. The monarchy is irrelevant to our age as it is to every age. And that is what also can make monarchy and the Crown timeless. It is practical, it is useful, it is prudent, it is all those very unfashionable values that no one thinks are worthwhile until they are absent from your polity. The Crown is an enduring institution, literally an enduring institution that goes beyond the petty politics of the day. The wise reposing by our Constitution of the executive power in the Crown provides Australia with stability and order in the day-to-day operation of government and an umpire in the case of parliamentary deadlock, as well as a source of valuable and uniting military traditions and a non-partisan allegiance in the Australian system and in the British system more generally. The armed forces, the police, the prosecutors and the other coercive and powerful arms of the state, they serve the Crown and not the government of the day. There is much to be said for such a distinction between the Crown that is served daily and to which allegiance is owed and the day-to-day responsiveness of public servants to the elected government which changes with elections. One junks and throws away such traditions and practices of legality, stability and good order only at one's national peril. Or as a relation of mine, and I come from a long line of terminal majors in the British Army, said to me, he said, the wonderful thing about the Crown, he said, is that you can loyally and zealously serve the Crown of the day, but you can also still simultaneously despise the political class. There is a lot to be said for that, particularly if you see what happens in America when there is a change of president and people suddenly develop affections or detestations for the president depending on their own personal politics. That, I think, is a state of affairs that is best avoided wherever one can. Finally, I would add that Australia's Constitution provides in Chapter 1 for a House composed of members representing the interests of their local electoral divisions and a Senate composed of senators representing the interests of their states. Our Constitution does not, and was never intended to, foster a party system and a permanent political class. It was never intended to provide career tracks or endless career loops for politicians, staffers, advisors, lobbyists, government relations experts, and a host of other vagabonds and, frankly, crooks that are found in the swamp of the postcode 2600. It was said of the Roman general Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus that when Rome was threatened, Cincinnatus left his small farm, laying down his plough as to wield his sword in Rome's cause, and that once Rome had been saved and the danger passed, Cincinnatus gave up power most willingly to return to his farm, return his sword to its scabbard, and plough once again his fields. We are a long way from the 6th and 5th centuries BC of Rome. However, the story of Cincinnatus was very well known to the early American Republic. The example of George Washington preventing the Newburgh riot of his army in 1783, and then serving 2 terms as the American president, and then surrendering power gracefully to return to Mount Vernon and his farm, is perhaps the best example of Cincinnatus since the ancient times. Nonetheless, this ancient model of political life and public service as a periodic vocation for serious people, not a career, must return in our own times if we are to have any hope for improving the standards of our parliament and our governance, As Montesquieu wrote in his Spirit of the Laws, the deterioration of a government begins almost always by the decay of its principles. The Republican movement, so far as I am aware, is entirely silent on these incredibly important issues to the health and the trust in our constitutional democracy. The Republic debate, in my view, whatever view you do take ultimately, is an opportunity for all Australians to rediscover not just our Constitution and the principles on which it is founded, but also to defend them against those whose negligence and stupidity will threaten them and their basic law. So it is over to Australia's Republicans to make their case and to propose their new Constitution, or at least the large and necessary constitutional amendments it will require. My view is that if you are for a republic, if you are a Republican, it is incumbent upon you to propose a new Constitution, not make an unsafe attempt to warp or tame or corrupt our Constitution into bearing a Republican form which it cannot. And I would ask that these new Constitution, these new amendments be done in explicit detail and well in advance of any referendum, with the time needed for the needed debates to go on and for every sensible Australian to have their say and to also raise their grave concerns as to what dangers a move to republic may involve. As the rest of my fellow Australians, please remember that these debates will occur, and they must occur in respect of our Constitution, and as the ancient maxim found on war memorials across Australia and across the world, they must be inspired by the maxim that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Please, everyone in this room, be ever vigilant to protect your Constitution. It can be said of the Australian Constitution, and I say it frequently to my students of the Australian Constitution, that it was drafted by geniuses so that Australia could be governed by fools. The Constitution is our fundamental law, and if it unravels, so too will the Australian nation that the Constitution literally constitutes. As the Romans would say, caveat. Thank you.